Captain Midnight.
We're getting closer and closer to July 7th, when the world will finally get their first look at the shiny new Spider-Man Homecoming. The internet is buzzing with speculation. How big of a role will Tony Stark play? Who's Donald Glover playing? What's Zendaya doing in this? Is she playing Mary Jane? Wow, there's just so much to talk about. Which means I'll be giving the internet exactly what they want. An entire video about the CBS Spider-Man show from the late 70s. That's what people want, right? Anybody? You know, it wasn't that long ago that turning a comic book giant like Spider-Man into a film or television show wasn't a recipe to make billions of dollars. It might be hard to picture these days, where directors and actors spend a ton of time trying to convince comic book fans that they'll treat the source material like some holy text.
So thanks for having me. You have no idea how much this means to me. I've always wanted to come here as a fan, and this is my first time, so here I am as a fan.
But once upon a time, comic book properties weren't exactly seen as surefire hits. Richard Donner's Superman and Tim Burton's Batman both had to hire popular, beloved actors to be taken seriously as anything other than low-rent and childish. Nowhere can you see this old mentality more than CBS's The Amazing Spider-Man, which ran for 2 short seasons starting in 1977. The show is remembered mostly as a punchline because of its hilariously dated effects. Of course, that's if it's being remembered at all. I remember being 6 or 7 years old and being a big Spider-Man fan before any of the Sam Raimi movies came out, and seeing the VHS cover of the show at Blockbuster. And I was so excited. A live-action Spider-Man movie? This is going to be the best thing ever. It just had to be. It had Spider-Man in it. So my parents rented it, and like any kid watching a 90-minute TV pilot from 1977 in the year 2000 would probably be, I was less than impressed. But all the buzz around Homecoming got me thinking about that show, and the vague details of it I could remember. So thanks to the wonders of the internet, I was able to rewatch it, and a few other episodes too. And they were, well, I'll get into it. First off, I apologize for the low quality footage. This show has never been released on Blu-ray or DVD, and it isn't streaming anywhere. The only releases of it are on VHS, so everything you'll see is transfers of the VHS tapes that some saint out there posted online. The 2-part pilot, which is a little over an hour and a half long, but manages to feel like 3, was directed by E.W. Swackhammer. These days, Marvel mostly gets, like, hip indie directors to direct their movies. Cool directors, cool young and in-demand stars. Marvel can basically get whoever they want. In 1977, things were a little different. Apparently back then, if you directed 8 episodes of The Partridge Family and a few episodes of I Dream of Jeannie, and had an awesome name that sounded like a corrupt cattle baron, you were perfect to direct the screen debut of the world's most popular superhero. The show's Peter Parker is played by Nicholas Hammond, probably best known for playing Frederick Von Trapp in The Sound of Music 12 years earlier. 13 episodes in the show was done. Not because of bad ratings or anything, it did pretty well. I mean, today any network on Earth would kill for those numbers. But because CBS was embarrassed of becoming the superhero network, they had the Incredible Hulk, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man. In 2017, this sounds like the CW's wet dream. But back then, CBS was afraid of their lineup being seen as too juvenile. And The Amazing Spider-Man was the least loved of the 3, so they cut it loose. And watching the show, that makes sense. The Incredible Hulk and Wonder Woman don't exactly hold up for me personally, but they were both shows that knew their formula and what kind of show they wanted to be. Spider-Man is confused. The show has no idea what it wants to be, other than vaguely likable and vaguely exciting. I guess I should talk about the pilot now. I don't think there's anybody these days that needs the origin of Spider-Man explained. We've seen it over and over again. But it makes sense that his live-action debut would want to go through it. But here's the thing. This pilot has almost no interest in its protagonist's origin story. If anything, it's more of a subplot. The show opens on an old man getting a checkup at the doctor's office, you know, like you want your Spider-Man show to, and then immediately gets into the villain's boring mind control scheme. When we finally get to Peter, who's a grad student already working at the Daily Bugle in this, he's talking to his level-headed, perfectly reasonable boss, J. Jonah Jameson. Seriously, Jameson is like a perfectly chill boss in this show.
I could get you what you want.
Look, I appreciate your working your way through college. That's what I did.
Even more so as the show goes on. After the pilot, they recast him with an even nicer old guy who actually kind of likes Spider-Man. At least Robbie's there. He's basically the same as his comic counterpart, just a little younger, so I guess that's cool. Except he disappears after the pilot, too. But anyway, what's weird about this Peter Parker is how little his own show seems to care about him. We watch him complain to Jonah and then work on a school project with his lab partner, who is in like one extremely long scene and never comes back. But his home life is really an afterthought. He still lives with Aunt May in Queens, which is kind of weird because he's 27 and not 16. But leaving that aside, in the pilot she's in 2 scenes, and then she gets recast and comes back in like 1 episode. It's almost bizarre how little the show cares about anything outside of Peter's job at the Bugle. And I'm not saying the show needs to be 100% faithful to the comics. You can't do supervillains because you think they'll be too expensive? Great. You want to give Peter a new love interest who wasn't in the comics? Fine. You want J. Jonah Jameson to be a boring, normal boss who barely ever raises his voice? A little weird, but okay. But if you can't even be bothered to include Uncle Ben as a character in the pilot of your Spider-Man show, is it even a Spider-Man show anymore? You're taking your hero's main motivation, the thing that drives all of his actions after the first issue of the comics, and replacing it with nothing. Most of the beats are the same, spider bite, wall crawling, web fluid, but you've removed the most important part, the heart of the Spider-Man origin story. It's a weird choice, and his motivation makes almost no sense. I mean, sure, Peter Parker is a nice guy, I guess it makes some sense that he'd want to help people, but this Peter Parker doesn't really seem that nice. He doesn't seem like anything, really. He's like a polite, whiny blank slate.
Why'd you scare him off? I need those condensers.
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
And other than being good at science stuff and needing money, he doesn't really have any personality traits, let alone an actual personality. So why does he even decide to be Spider-Man instead of cashing in on his powers by wrestling or doing stunt shows like the comic book version of Peter did before Uncle Ben died? Because the script needs him to. Because the show's called Spider-Man, I guess. As for the Daily Bugle, I get why the show decided to spend so much time there. Network shows sustain themselves then and now by using a specific story engine. The Bar in Cheers, the Police Precinct in Hill Street Blues, Magnum's job as a PI, they use them to create endless sources of stories. A new client, a criminal, or a family member could wander in every episode, creating new situations for the characters. The problem with The Amazing Spider-Man is that the Daily Bugle is painfully boring here. None of these characters have an interesting relationship or play off each other in fun ways. The show seems to know this too, and tries to address it by giving Peter a charming, flirty relationship with JJ's secretary in future episodes. But it's just not enough. These characters are no Norm and Cliff, or even Magnum and Higgins. There's nothing about these characters' interactions that would make audiences want to tune in for them every week. Getting back to the plot, after Peter and his preppy grad school buddy make fun of an old delivery man for being scared of the radioactive material in their lab, Peter manages to get bit by a spider hiding in the radioactive material in their lab. Then he hangs out in his aunt's attic, gets superpowers, and then almost gets run over by a car in an alley. It's weird because while this is going on, the actual focus of the pilot is on the villain, a professor who works at Peter's college, who brainwashes people into robbing banks and committing suicide. He never returns after the pilot and isn't exactly a great character, so I have no idea why the writers thought that his scheme should take up the bulk of their first episode. There's also a few other main characters, like the cigar-munching angry police captain who doesn't like Peter, who I kind of like actually. The actor is really going for it at least. He should have been playing J. Jonah Jameson, not this boring asshole.
Hey Parker, come here. Never mind the socializing, I want to talk to you.
Well, I'd like to congratulate you too, Captain. That was wonderful police work.
Ah, never mind the cauliflower. Where were you?
And there's also Peter's love interest, Judy, who is just kind of there. I watched this last night and I honestly can't remember one thing about her. But I guess we should talk about Spider-Man himself. In his first scene in the costume, I could figure out why I hated this show as a kid immediately. Spider-Man isn't Spider-Man in this show. He's like a weird silent mime in a costume. Sure, he'll yell and very occasionally talk, but he's never Spider-Man. Spider-Man cracks jokes and fights, and when he's not fighting, he's always got an insecure running monologue going, worrying about how rent is due next week, or how he accidentally stood up Mary Jane to search for the Scorpion. Yeah, sometimes it's corny, but it's undeniably Spider-Man. And 7-year-old me, like I'm guessing plenty of kids sitting down in their wood-paneled living rooms to watch the show in 1977, didn't recognize Spider-Man in this quiet, small-eyed weirdo. As for the special effects, I actually kind of like some of them. The POV shots where they strapped whatever the 70s version of a GoPro was to a stuntman and jumped between buildings was kind of cool. Or at least a really smart, creative way to handle web slinging, which I'm pretty sure was impossible to pull off with what they had. Sometimes the wall crawling looks pretty good, and sometimes not so much. And I'd say the same about the fight scenes. I'm pretty forgiving to the old effects, and I kind of enjoy watching the ways they'd figure out how to show his powers without much money or CGI. Sure, I could point out stuff like when Spider-Man is climbing on the side of a building, his shadow pretty clearly gives away that he's just crawling around on the ground. I mean, come on, Swackhammer, what are you doing, man? But that almost feels mean. They did the best with what they had, so I'm not going to fault them for it. Is there anything else I like about it? Well, I really like the scene where Spider-Man gets injured and tries to get a ride home in a cab. The cab rider understandably doesn't want to give him a ride, and he's forced to sneak into the back of a garbage truck. It doesn't really get much more Peter Parker than that. It was one of the few times that I really recognized the character I've known and loved for so long in the show. I like how when Peter first gets his powers, he can't stop looking at the tall buildings to climb up because he's just so excited about how awesome it is to climb walls. That was fun, and it really just expressed the joy of being Spider-Man well. Oh, and the scenes where the villain is mind-controlling everyone to kill themselves, it's actually pretty effective. I understand now why it's one of the few parts I remembered. It's a genuinely creepy sequence. And that's mostly about it. Nicholas Hammond is fine as Peter, but he's given almost nothing to play. The show as a whole is pretty underwhelming. But still, I think there's something worth looking at here, if only to see how much has changed. Superheroes have taken over pop culture. And if you're really young, it probably seems like it's always been that way. But all you have to do is pop in a couple episodes of The Amazing Spider-Man to see just how different we treat superhero adaptations today.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.